Okay, so I have just turned the recorder on. Welcome everybody to the Center for Suicide Prevention and the Alberta Centre for Injury Control and Research's webinar, 5 Things We Wish All Teachers Knew About Contagion, Social Media, and Suicide. We've had a great deal of interest today and we're so glad you could attend. As I indicated, we are recording this session and we will be making it available at the Center for Suicide Prevention's website, as well as all the previous recordings of webinars are available there. And a schedule of the next upcoming webinars is also available at that location. Participants will be in listen-only mode, so please ask questions or provide comments using the chat box feature at the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side. I think what we'll do is we'll ask you to hold all your questions until Robert's done his presentation, and then he can answer them at the end of the presentation. So because we wanted to keep the webinar short and sweet, we have just provided a synopsis of the information about the subject matter experts, and as well, one of the slides also provides some information on the 2 centers. And so with that, Robert, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Patty. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining in on our webinar series, The 5 Things We Wish All Teachers Knew. And in particular today, the topic is social media, suicidal contagion, and suicide clusters. The content of this presentation is drawn from an article I wrote on contagion and clusters in the spring of 2013. I'll provide a link to it on the final slide. A little background on the article. I was at the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention Conference in Niagara Falls, Ontario in October 2012, the very week that the Amanda Todd story broke. I started receiving calls from media outlets via our organization here in Calgary, Global, CBC, Calgary Herald, and others, all asking if their reporting on the case would incite further suicides. I found I couldn't answer that satisfactorily in a 30-second soundbite. I couldn't give them the answer they were looking for. I merely said it was far too complex, like the issue of suicide itself, to give them a straight yes or no. Then I remember thinking, sure, it's possible that a contagion could occur if the story got too much coverage, but I also thought it might be an opportunity for discussion surrounding suicide, for the stigma to be addressed, for the silence to stop. First off, I'd just like to briefly define what we mean by contagion and clusters. It's long been thought that a publicized suicide may influence others to imitate the suicidal act. This is called suicidal contagion, or copycat suicide, or imitative suicide. There are imitative suicides of celebrities. There are imitative suicides of other highly publicized suicides. But there are also suicides that occur because someone is influenced by someone else they might know or have gone to school with. Not necessarily heard through mass media. It can seem like to them like an option to end their own pain. But then again, there are far more instances where contagion does not occur at all when there is a suicide. A suicide cluster is the occurrence of multiple suicides that fall within a narrow time frame and sometimes within a specific geographical area. So the first notion that we want you to know about today regarding today's topic is that some suicides create contagion and clusters and some do not. This seems maybe obvious, but I'll try and explain. In the 1970s, David Phillips coined the term Werther effect after the 18th century novel by the German writer Goethe. Many in Europe feared readers would imitate the suicidal death of its young protagonist Werther, who kills himself after a failed love affair. Authorities sought to have it banned in many countries. Phillips coined this because of the influence of celebrity suicide causing contagion in the 1950s and 60s, especially the death of Marilyn Monroe in 1962, where there was a 12% spike in suicides the month after her death. His research had a tremendous influence on those in suicide prevention and suicidology who believed that there was a direct link between media coverage of suicide and suicidal contagion. They further believed that those who are vulnerable to suicide should be protected from exposure to all stories of suicide. However, there are many who feel that there is no relationship between media coverage and suicidal contagion.
Robert, are you there? We lost your sound. Robert? Hello?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Okay, were the NHL suicides of the summer of 2011 linked in any way? Did the reporting of Derek Beauregard's death cause Rick Rippon and Wade Belak to take their lives? Did the recent suicides in the Canadian military have any relationship with one another? You'll get differing answers depending on who you talk to or what you read. Which leads us to fact 2, that the Canadian Psychiatric Association and other organizations such as the World Health Organization and the Center for Disease Control have guidelines which suggest how the mass media should cover suicide. They are not enforceable, merely prescriptive, but my experience has shown that by and large the media tries to adhere to them. The experience I mentioned about being at the conference in Niagara Falls and being inundated with calls from the media regarding Amanda Todd suggests to me that, in this instance anyway, the media was trying to do the right thing. Others would say that the media went ahead with saturation coverage of Todd's suicide anyway and did not properly abide by the guidelines. Again, it depends on your point of view. As far as the effectiveness of these guidelines go, there are those such as Dr. Goldblum of the Mental Health Commission of Canada and Andre Picard of the Globe and Mail, who believe that they are ineffectual and maybe even irrelevant. They feel that at the very least these guidelines should be modified to speak to social media and the web as well. Indeed, the advent of social media has really muddied the water. If you look on the screen, I have posted a few of this Canadian Psychiatric Association guidelines regarding media reportage of suicide. The mainstream media reports on suicide sometimes responsibly, sometimes not so much. But there are no rules on social media, no guidelines to follow. And this is hugely important because this is where our young people get most of their information. This segues to our third important point, the role of social media and its huge significance in the lives of youth. The case of Amanda Todd illustrated how pervasive and all-consuming social media can be for the young today. Most learned of her suicide after the fact by watching the YouTube video where she recounted her struggles with bullying and harassment. We watched with horror knowing that she had already carried out her suicidal plans. It had apparently been posted on YouTube for months before she killed herself. We learned of someone bullied and abused in the cyber world so extensively that it drove her to take her own life. Yet the allure of social media and its importance in her life did not allow her just to leave it alone. She had to go online. She could not help herself. It was a major part of her identity. And that's what it's like for most youth today. They can't function without utilizing social media. Even those few young people who choose to not indulge in social media can be effective. We have anecdotal evidence of students who have had fake Facebook pages attributed to them without their knowledge. This is identity theft at the very least, and it can show how anyone can post anything and attribute it to someone online. This is just one of the pitfalls of being online. So how do we work together with youth and their relationship with social media? Law enforcement and cyberbullying experts caution school staff and others who work with children not to punish students for using their cell phones or other devices. This tends to be an ineffective approach. The behavior will just be driven underground and undercover. The use of these devices is going to happen. We must accept it. A better approach may be to educate and inform them of the potential hazards of the online world, that impulsive actions can have huge impacts, that the content that they may put online may last forever. Most importantly, youth need to be encouraged to treat one another with respect and kindness online, and don't write something you wouldn't say to the person directly. Too often we are shrouded by the anonymity of the online world, and we need to remember that there is a person on the other end of our message. The fourth point is simply that cyberspace can be a dangerous and place and a negative experience for some youth. There is no shortage of horror stories of what some youth can experience online and the lengths that some are driven to, including suicide. There is, of course, Amanda Todd, but there's the story of Rehtaeh Parsons, which occurred a few months later. Bullied and harassed for months, she could not handle the abuse and took her life. There is Alexis Pilkington, who killed herself under similar circumstances and was bullied even after her death, with people denouncing and attacking her on Facebook. The recent event with the young man at the University of Guelph illustrates that the negative repercussions of social media can be self-inflicted as well. He streamed his attempted suicide online on a site called 4chan, and when he did not die, was savagely ridiculed and denounced on his Facebook page. Many urged him to try again. Sadly, there are so many more examples. These host sites must step up and make it more difficult for these abusive behaviors to occur. There must be no tolerance for bullying online. They must monitor the content of what they carry more carefully. They could implement a mechanism to make it more difficult to post anonymously, for example. I am convinced the cloak of anonymity is responsible for much of the negative practices online. And the fifth point we'd like to emphasize is that social media can also be a very positive tool as well, including the prevention of suicide. There was a cluster of suicides that occurred in Red Deer in 2012-2013. 6 17-year-old high school males all took their own lives within a 6-month time span. This phenomenon was actually brought to the attention of the general public because of a Facebook page devoted to the memory of the teens who killed themselves. This was a grassroots gesture as a means of comforting those affected by the suicides, and was set up by a trio of Red Deer teenage girls who were presumably acquainted with at least some of the deceased young men. Interestingly, the mass media, in this case the Red Deer Advocate, only then reported on this cluster, even though it was apparently well known at the schools and in the community that these males attended and in the general community that this epidemic was occurring. Social media also allows for conversation surrounding suicide to be furthered. I would argue that the Amanda Todd suicide generated more opportunities to talk about suicide than any story in recent memory. Dialogue and education about this topic helps to reduce the stigma. Facebook, Twitter, and the like have tremendous potential in this regard. Also, as teens increasingly use these platforms as their means to socialize and converse, they increasingly become more the area where they will voice suicidal thoughts and intentions. Therefore, these sites can also become important as a place to intervene. If someone expresses suicidal ideation online, there may be more of an opportunity to get the person help, whereas in the past, without such avenues, the person may have been left to their own devices and carried out a suicidal act. Lastly, we'd like to offer you some points you need to know should a suicide occur in your school. This is the phase known as postvention in the suicide continuum, which includes prevention, intervention, and postvention. And postvention is absolutely critical, especially in an environment such as a school. This is what is recommended for how you and your school should approach a suicide. Keep in mind that research shows that although the chance for a contagion is low, the occurrence of a suicide does increase the chances for another to happen. One reason for this is because if someone who is known and he takes his own life, it sort of legitimizes and normalizes the idea of suicide for those who may be also at risk for suicide. With this in mind, schools should make a concerted effort to identify those students who might be at risk of suicide themselves. For example, you should be aware of any marked change in a student's behavior. In this context, perhaps a student suddenly shuts down some of his or her social network accounts. The student's friends bring this to your attention. You should think of this as a contemporary equivalent of the student no longer coming to school. It's a big deal. Schools should allow for opportunities to grieve, but they must be careful not to glorify, romanticize, or sensationalize the death. Some schools have allowed temporary displays of flowers and messages that must be taken down at the end of the day, for example. Schools must treat a suicidal death as they would treat any other student's death. If a student is treated differently than, say, an accidental death or someone who is a victim of a disease such as cancer, the stigma of suicide unwittingly may be reinforced. It's recommended that a memorial or assembly involving the entire school not occur. It may suggest to some that suicide may be an acceptable act, and this may be attractive to the vulnerable and those at risk. Permanent memorials are also discouraged for similar reasons. It can be a constant reminder to those at risk to consider suicide as an option. Let students know that help is available if they are in crisis. Most school boards have policies regarding suicide and responses to suicide. We recommend everyone familiarize themselves with them. In closing, I would encourage you to go to our website at www.suicideinfo.ca and check out our articles on cyberbullying, contagion in clusters, suicidal ideation on social networks, and suicidal memorials after a suicide, among other articles. If you have any questions for me directly, you can reach me at robert@suicideinfo.ca. I would now like to take the opportunity to ask if any of you out there have any questions. Okay. Yeah, someone asked if they could get a copy of the slides. Indeed, they will be available tomorrow, so on our website. Oh, that's right. Are there any more questions out there? Please feel free.
I think there's a few questions coming, Robert.
Yeah, I can see that.
What can you do to make
Well, someone asked what we can do to make sites more accountable. Well, I think ultimately that has to come from the hosts themselves. But if enough pressure comes from users to demand some extra accountability from the domain hosts, I believe that is one area where it can be improved upon. I know Facebook has a more explicit policy on suicide than they used to a couple of years ago when I investigated how they dealt with suicidal thoughts online. They now have a more rigid and straightforward policy regarding that. So that shows to me that change can occur and progress can be made.
sessions outside
Yes, we do. Someone asked if we have training sessions outside of Calgary. Yes, we have sessions all over the province of Alberta that stem from our office here in Calgary. So just give us a call if you are curious about if one is occurring in your community.
just
Someone asks, how do you respond to students or families who want permanent memorials? Well, again, it's widely thought that a permanent memorial is just not does not send a positive message in this case. So I would have to say I would or a school should respond in using that reasoning that they wouldn't want to cause further suicides to occur, to give any kind of positivity to such such an act, I guess. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the questions here. Sorry?
The question is, we are wondering about not having a service. Do these schools have a service if there was a
Someone asked if wouldn't schools have a service for another type of death. I don't believe they would. I think, generally speaking, there are no whole school assemblies for any kind of cancer. Normally.
Robert, it's Patty.
Sorry?
Sorry, I do know that many schools actually do have memorial services when a student or staff loses their life due to some other reason, illness or a collision, a motor vehicle crash. So if there are policies around accidental deaths and what a school does around those, would it be appropriate to observe the same kinds of policies for a suicide death?
Well, if there's a precedent set, say in a particular school, I suppose that they could continue on with that precedent, but without calling attention to the nature of the death. So there's a fine line, I suppose.
Can I add to this, Robert? I think it's a good question, and it's one that would require that certainly we need to be respectful of family members and the community that are involved. And it's a tough call, but I know that many times many schools in working with the family choose to try and honor those wishes by purchasing books to add to the library, some way of acknowledging and commemorating the life of that student in a way that doesn't necessarily lend itself to increasing the risk, but something that perhaps again speaks to and needs to speak to family members and friends and who are clearly bereaved by this death.
Thanks, Linda. Did you hear that, Patty? From Linda? Hello? Okay. Next one. Thanks, Linda.
Robert, sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. Linda tried to answer that a bit of your query there, and I hope everyone heard that.
Here's what it says: we have large numbers of students from different cultures and different views of death and suicide, and suggests that the clusters of cultural responsibility that we know.
Someone asked how to respond to contagion and clusters in a culturally responsive way. I think as a school, the policy should make no distinction on how they respond to suicidal death, but individually, of course, prevention and postvention, those clinicians who work in those fields would definitely take specific backgrounds into account and their beliefs in suicide when dealing with the family and the survivors of suicide.
We've already been answered. It says, what if the memorial has been done for other types of deaths in the past?
Again, someone asked what if a permanent memorial, I understand, has been set up in the past to deal with other types of deaths. Again, if a precedent has been set, perhaps one could be, but again, it would have to be taken on case-by-case basis. And again, there's a fine line. Yes, we must take into consideration those who are at risk, and so we wouldn't want to glorify, in a way, which a memorial does sometimes, a tribute, so to speak. So it might entice others to consider that route.
There's a question that says students sometimes freeze when they see their peers posting about suicidal thoughts and actions. Fortunately, some come forward and share their concerns, others do not. How do we help students to understand their cyber citizenship responsibility?
Okay, so we have a question.
This question says, students sometimes freeze when they see their peers posting about suicidal thoughts and actions. Unfortunately, some come forward and share their concerns, others do not. How do we help students to understand their cyber citizenship responsibility?
Okay, there's a question about, someone asks that not enough peers are responding to individuals who voice suicidal thoughts on social networks. He or she believes asks how we can make those students more accountable, step up and help out fellow students who are acting suicidally. Well, I guess the influence of peer pressure and just I guess, and the repetition, the increase in those types of acts may set a certain level that others will try to emulate from then on. So.
Relationships that Christian students. One of the thoughts for teachers to try.
Robert, it's Patty. I'm not quite sure that we got that complete answer with regards to how we encourage students to understand their cyber citizenship responsibilities.
Pardon me, Patty? Sorry?
I don't think we heard complete response to your to the question about students and helping them understand their cyber citizenship responsibilities.
Oh, I see. Sorry. Okay.
For a minute.
There's students and their cyberbullying responsibilities. Again, I think the element of peer pressure is probably the strongest element that's in the mix as far as the answer to that question goes. If people are encouraged or kind of they see others helping others who are suicidal online, and they feel obligated to do the same, I think progress can be made in that way. Did you hear that one? Okay. Okay, now let's.
Yes.
Teachers can also talk in person.
Oh, and teachers can also talk in person with students if it's brought to their attention, of course. If they have to know about it, definitely. And try to convey to students that it's a good idea to be cyber responsible. So.
Okay, so I see perhaps we have one more question coming or not. I can't, nope, maybe not. So are there any more questions for Robert or his host of experts down in Calgary?
I'll take that.
Okay, so everybody's
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so I think with that, We will thank you, Robert, and your colleagues at the Center for Suicide Prevention for an insightful presentation. If people have further questions after today, they can certainly direct them right to the Center for Suicide Prevention. And we will forward a link to the recording and additional resources in the next few days to those people who registered. And if you don't receive that email, then you can gain that information by going to the Center for Suicide Prevention's website. And they have conveniently on the front page a link right to the webinars and the recordings. We're always interested in feedback and ideas. If you have some other suggestions for us, we will also send out a survey. So with that, I will just unmute Calgary again. And Calgary, thank you very much for the presentation today.
Thank you, everyone,
everybody have a good evening.
Thanks.